The Spaniards discovered to their surprise that the inhabitants of the archipelago possessed a writing system as well as widespread literacy. Unlike the alphabet, which the intruders employed, the local population used a syllabary, a system in which each symbol represented a syllable. The Spaniards called the system baybayin, a system of writing that William Henry Scott described as one of 12 or more indigenous alphabets from such Southeast Asian islands as Sumatra, Java, and Sulawesi, which are ultimately derived from ancient India and share the Sanskrit characteristic that any consonant is pronounced with the vowel A following it, diacritical marks being added to express other vowels. Here is an example with the basic list of symbols at the top, and then how you change it depending on where the diacritical marks are to be found. For all the talk about baybayin, no record of the use of this word by Tagalogs in any Tagalog document, at least through the 18th century, can be found. In fact, the Spaniards themselves did not use the word baybayin to describe the indigenous writing system. In Pedro Chirino's 1604 Relación, which includes a chapter, chapter 15, of the writing of the Filipinos, with examples of the writing system, the word baybayin is not found. While Pedro de San Buenaventura's vocabulario, published in 1613, includes the following entry, baybayin, ABC. Later, he refers to the writing system as sulat-tao. The second mention of baybayin is found in 1754 in another vocabulario by Luceda y Sanlúcar. The book that this paper focuses on had more than 22 pages in the indigenous writing, but the word baybayin does not appear. Instead, we hear letra Tagala, escritura Tagala, and escritura antigua. That the indigenous system was accepted as valid by the Spanish authorities is demonstrated in three significant ways. First of all was its use in the printing of books for the local population, beginning with the Doctrina Cristiana in 1593, all the way through 1608, a confessional guide. Secondly, documents were written using the indigenous syllabary, and they were accepted as valid. The two famous bills of sale found at the UST archives are examples of this. Thirdly, the local inhabitants were allowed to sign their names using the indigenous writing. This was the case for both men and women. The two bills of sale mentioned above were in fact signed by both women and men, and the famous divorce case in 1647 between Bernardo de Mabasa and Maria Mutia contained signatures of both parties. Yet, for all its acceptance, the indigenous syllabary presented almost insurmountable problems for the Spaniards. First of all, there were letters in Spanish not contained in the syllabary. Pinpin deals with this in the second chapter of his book when he writes about the difference between Spanish writing and Tagalog writing. The Spaniards had more characters, letters, and sounds not found in Tagalog, and the Spaniards could not use their letters interchangeably, as is the case with some letters, both consonants and vowels, in Tagalog. The necessity or the place of guessing when reading the indigenous writings was considered the greatest weakness in the eyes of the Spaniards. Adivinar is the word that one finds used all the way from Blancas de San Jose in 1610 through San Gaspar de San Agustin in 1702. Francisco Blancas de San Jose, the Dominican, was perhaps the greatest Spanish expert in Tagalog, and certainly the most prolific writer of books in Tagalog, including 2 or 3, we're not sure which, in the indigenous syllabary. In his introduction to the Arte y Reglas de la Lengua Tagala, this is written for friars in 1610, Blancas de San Jose wrote of the syllabary, those who wish to speak well should learn to read Tagalog characters, since it is such an easy matter that they can be learned ordinarily in 1 hour. Although reading the Tagalog language in its own characters without faltering as we read our own Spanish language no Spaniard will ever be able to do in all his life, though it might be as long as Adam's. The book I'm looking at is Libro ay naisurátan amin bagás Doctrina Cristiana. That is to say, a book in which is written the substance or all the substance of Christian doctrine. It is supposed to be a translation of Cardinal Bellarmino's Catechism into Ilocano. Francisco Lopez, Augustinian, was assigned to this task. And as Father Hernando Becerra tells us, it took Lopez more than 10 years to complete this task. This is indicated by the men who approved it, the 3 examiners who approved the text in 1616. In this book, Lopez proposes a solution to the problem of the indigenous writing system. The location of his solution is intriguing. After more than 50 pages, a series of licenses and approvals, verses in Latin and other material, one finds what you would expect to find in a catechism: the Our Father, Amami, Hail Mary, Ave Maria, the Apostles' Creed, Mamatiak, and others. These are followed by 7 pages of question and answer between a priest and a parishioner. Then Lopez gives close to 23 pages in the indigenous syllabary. At the end of these 23 pages, Lopez explains an innovation he has introduced, first to the Spaniards and then to the local population. This is the title page of this book, Libro ay naisurátan amin bagás Doctrina Cristiana. You'll notice that the date is 1621. It was also published in 1620. And here he writes in Ilocano using Spanish letters, the Amami, that is, Our Father, which he then writes using the indigenous system of writing. What Lopez proposed was to add a diacritical mark below a symbol. You see it at the top of the page, this middle letter here, and then there's one here as well. This is the Our Father here, and you will see that there is a cross here. It cancels out the vowel value of the symbol. Lopez wanted to solve the problem of not being able to end a word with a consonant. So he proposed the cruz, the cross, put it under the syllabary symbol, and that would make it a consonant that could stand alone. As I said, Scott saw the system of writing in the Philippines as coming from Sanskrit, and the virama is used in Sanskrit to do precisely that. You have the symbol that cancels out the vowel value. Lopez then gives an explanation for this innovation, first in Spanish, that is to the Spaniards, and then to the Ilocanos. The explanations are not the same. In Spanish, Lopez begins by writing, having put the text of the Doctrina in Tagalog script, and then parenthesis, which is the most universal of these islands, I began to correct the said Tagalog script, which in itself is deficient and so confusing for not having until now any possibility to write consonants without a value. To the Ilocano reader, Lopez begins, that is why I added this prayer also written in Tagalog. He means the Tagalog system of writing, Tintagalog is the word he uses, in order to correct and make right the way it is written in Tagalog, again, Tintagalog. In other times, it was deficient in the way it was written, the old way, the Dumang Aldao. There's something lacking, okay? To the Spanish reader, Lopez is correcting the indigenous script. To the Ilocano readers, the script is described as deficient, tanakurang nagpaiso. It's really lacking something. But to both groups, the system of writing is Tagalog. I think this is important. While the book Libro ay naisurátan was produced in 1620, 1621, it came after works in Tagalog were no longer being produced by the friars. It came 10 years after the first book in Visayan was published. Interestingly enough, also a translation of Bellarmino's Doctrina Cristiana. As it took Lopez so long to produce this work, he began in 1606, it could be that while he was working on this project, other friars were working on the Tagalog books as well as the book in Visayan. The significance of this dating is that the innovation proposed by Lopez would not be limited to the Ilocanos. Certainly the case of writing that is referred to as la letra Tagala or la escritura Tagala. It's also asserted that it was the most universal that is found throughout the islands. The book was published in Convento de San Pablo in Manila. So there's a very strong possibility that Lopez's audience was not merely Ilocanos, in fact, not primarily Ilocanos, but Tagalogs and others who use this system of writing. But why fix the system? At this point, we can only guess at his reason for doing this. Yes, you could argue it made it easier to read this indigenous system of writing, particularly with Ilocano, which has the double consonants so often. Well, why not simply write Ilocano or Tagalog or Visayan using the Spanish alphabet? After all, there are more than 400 pages after these 23 pages in the indigenous script, more than 400 pages of Ilocano written with the Spanish alphabet. Since 1583, the earliest document we have in Tagalog written with the Spanish alphabet, Tagalogs had been writing using the Spanish alphabet. And in 1593, the Doctrina Cristiana was in Spanish, in Tagalog using Spanish alphabet, and in the indigenous system of writing, the indigenous syllabary. Any attempt to correct this system would be for the local population, not simply limited to the Ilocanos, but anyone who used the syllabary system of writing. This is one reason why I think the dating of the book is so important. Its aim was not merely the Ilocano people, but those throughout the archipelago who used the syllabary. One could argue that Lopez's innovation was an attempt to duplicate an alphabetic approach while using the Tagalog syllabary. But such a shift, such a change represented not only a different way of writing, but also a different perception of language and reality, as the expert natives, we'll hear about in a minute, concluded. Lopez was trying to correct what he and others saw as a problem. But Pedro Chirino, the Jesuit at the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century, often wrote about Filipino literacy. He had no objection to vowel final syllables. Quote, final consonants are omitted in all words. In spite of this, they understand and make themselves understood wonderfully well and without ambiguities. The reader easily and skillfully supplies the omitted consonants. Professor Vicente Rafael has used the metaphor of fishing to describe a distinctive Tagalog strategy of decontextualizing the means by which colonial authority represents itself. That is to say, this is how Tagalogs mediated information communication that came from the Spanish authorities. As I've suggested elsewhere, this metaphor is really helpful in understanding not merely the communication between the Spanish authorities and their Tagalog subjects, but rather communication between Tagalogs themselves. In an intriguing chapter entitled 12 Ways to Make Learning to Read Difficult, in his book Essays into Literacy, Frank Smith's fifth chapter is Discouraging Guessing. Discouraged guessing. Using a form of double negative, Smith is in fact encouraging guessing, something that the Spaniards seemed determined to avoid. The next chapter in his book is entitled The Role of Prediction. He writes, reading is impossible without prediction. And since it is only through reading that children learn to read, it follows that the opportunity to develop and employ skills of prediction must be a critical part of learning to read. And again, for all their fluency in Tagalog, the Spaniards lacked to a certain degree a strong ability to guess or predict or supply the needed consonant at the end of a word. And they simply preferred not to do so. They saw the system as incomplete and unintelligible. Lopez had a solution, the cruz. You put it under a symbol and the vowel value is gone. So again, why not simply write using the Spanish alphabet? Because writing with the Spanish alphabet did not remove the need for intuition, but only if the diacritical marks and the accents are retained, and they were not. The question we need to ask and answer is what has the primary position, writing or speaking? In discussing Antonio de Nebreja's role in standardizing Castilian grammar and spelling, Professor Rafael observes, Nebreja gives writing a position subordinate to voice and places voice ultimately in the service of the soul's thought. The importance of writing hence revolves around its double function of representing voice and regulating the diversity of voices. In personal correspondence, I've discussed the issue of accents when writing any Filipino language. The linguist Jean-Paul Potet has responded that although, of course, a native speaker may constitute the meaning with little effort, printing without accents means that non-Tagalogs cannot improve their knowledge of Tagalog by reading books, magazines, and newspapers. And Potet points out to the need for two qualities, to be a native speaker and the place of intuition, what he would call chance, what the Spaniards would call adivinar. As a non-native speaker myself and coming from an Ilocano background, I would agree that accent marks and the maragsa, which is non-existent in Ilocano, would be most helpful. But intuition is a fundamental and necessary component of Tagalog, Ilocano, and other languages found in the archipelago. It is first found in the syllabary, in the indigenous writing system, but it remains in the modern writing using Roman letters. Don Pedro Andres, writing in 1776, more than 150 years after Libro and naisurátan, based on an earlier tradition, details the reaction of Filipinos to this innovation, the cruz. Quote, the expert natives were consulted about the new invention, asking to adopt it and use it in all their writings for the convenience of all. But after praising the invention of the little cross and showing profuse gratitude for it, they decided it could not be accepted into their writing because it went against the intrinsic properties and nature that God had given to their writing, and that to use it was tantamount to destroying with one blow all the syntax, prosody, and orthography of their Tagalog language. End of quote. And while it is unlikely that they use words such as syntax, prosody, that is the patterns of stress and intonation in the language, and orthography, it seems clear that they recognize that Lopez's innovation would in fact go against the fundamental nature of the indigenous writing. As Juan R. Francisco rightly pointed to basic deficiencies in the friars' understanding of the old system, it was seen in, quote, their lack of understanding of the nuances of both language and script. This was certainly the case with Francisco Lopez and his attempt to change the nature of syllabic writing in the Philippines, to move it from a syllabary to an alphabet. It was a project, happily, that failed. Thank you.